A World History of Christianity, Chapter 11, Part 1, North America, Robert Bruce Mullen. The story of Christianity in North America is a story both like and unlike the story of Christianity elsewhere. Issues of Catholicism versus Protestantism, learning versus heartfelt religion, and adaptation versus resistance to culture pepper the narrative here as they do elsewhere. But Christians in North America, perhaps more than any other Christian community, have been forced to confront two overarching challenges. The first concerned the great task of Christianizing a vast continent. The second concerned the balancing of unity and diversity. Both factors stem from the unique situation in which North American Christians found themselves. Christianity entered North America through the great folk migration of Europeans from the Old World to the New. On the new continent, all of the carefully constructed supports of a Christian culture were eerily absent. The landscape bespoke the awesomeness of nature rather than the architectural presence of Christian civilization, and laws and customs, long considered foundational, were lacking. To Christianize the landscape and to transform the natural order formed a great concern. Nor was this simply the task of the first generations. As the frontier progressed, the challenge of Christianization progressed along with it. Yet it was not one Christianity, but many Christianities, which were dutifully transported to the New World by the myriad of settlers. The particularities of these inherited faiths became a cherished sense of self-identification in the new environment. Writing in the early 20th century, the British observer James Bryce noted, "Each race has, as a rule, adhered to the form of religion it held in Europe." How to fashion a sense of religious unity in the face of such diversity would be a recurring theme in North American religious life. In both of these ways, the pattern of Christianity in North America would differ from that of Europe. 17th century beginnings. When the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus landed on what is now probably San Salvador in the Caribbean Sea and claimed all he found for the King and Queen of Spain, he reflected that what had occurred was no mere discovery, but an inauguration of a new era in sacred history. Let Christ rejoice on earth as he rejoices in heaven in the prospect of the salvation of the souls of so many nations hitherto lost. Conquest and conversion were interlocking themes in the founding of the Americas, and they were themes about which Christianity would play a key role. Spain, France, Britain, Sweden, and the Netherlands all laid claims to parts of what is now North America and planted their church life there. Spain brought to the west, southwest, and other parts of what is now the United States its vision of Roman Catholicism. France brought its own form of Catholicism to Canada and parts of the great American heartland. Sweden and the Netherlands for a time exercised control of what is now Delaware and New York, and they attempted to establish their own Reformation churches. Finally, Britain exported the confusions of its own Reformation settlement to different parts of what are now the United States and Canada. Yet, in all these plantations, the Christian life that emerged was shaped by tensions between the vision of the founders and the distinctive nature of the environment. Let us take three examples: the English colony in Virginia, the settlements in the Lawrence River Valley in New France, and the English Puritan settlements in New England. In each case, vision and environment shaped Christian development. The Virginia colony attempted to reconstitute the English Protestant Church of the early Jacobean period. A theological loyalty to the Reformed faith was combined with a fealty to the practices and observances of the prayer book tradition. In instructions to an early governor, it was stated, "You shall take principal order and care for the true and reverent worship of God, that his word be duly preached and his holy sacraments administered according to the constitution of the Church of England in all fundamental points, and all atheism, profaneness, popery, or schism be exemplary punished to the honor of God and the peace and safety of his church. Despite the lofty ideal, however, the early history of the colony was as troubled and halting as was its religious life. At times, governors such as Thomas Dale attempted to use religion to enforce discipline on the colony. His laws divine, moral, and martial made blasphemy a capital offense, while at other times the colony's General Assembly likewise attempted to enforce details of moral action. Yet despite these attempts, colonial Virginia was never to be known as a particularly godly commonwealth. The established church served another purpose. From early on, perhaps to overcome the vastness of the virgin continent and the distance from familiar institutions, the ceremonies and dignities of the old established religion were kept. As one contemporary account recalled, every Sunday, when the Lord Governor went to church, he was accompanied by his counselors, captains, and all the gentlemen, and with a guard of 50 halberdiers in the lordship's living, fair red cloaks on each side and beside him. There in worship, governors and counselors sat each in their place. For the settlers of Virginia to be connected to their homeland, symbols of sacred authority were necessary. Thus the church in Virginia was established by law. At first the parent London Company, and later the General Assembly of the colony, set up parishes and set forth requirements for the support of a ministry. Yet the Anglican model in the South was shaped over the course of the colonial period by the absence of bishops in America. The lack of a resident bishop resulted in crucial authority devolving upon laypersons. This was the background for the famous vestry system, one of the distinctive features of the colonial church in Virginia. Vestries were charged to elect ministers to parishes, levy tithes, care for indigents and orphans, and perform other social functions. But quickly vestries took upon themselves the authority of hiring and firing of clergy. Still another peculiarity of the established church in Virginia was its legal status. Although religiously connected to the Church of England through the Bishop of London, it was legally subservient to the Virginia Assembly. If the established Church of Virginia attempted to transplant the Reformed faith of 16th century Anglicanism, the Church of New France strove to transplant the Catholic religion of the French homeland. But even here the simple picture unravels with close analysis. Despite the historic interconnection between French-Canadian culture and the religion of Roman Catholicism, in its origins the story of Christianity in New France was never simply a story of French immigrants, but included missions to the native peoples. Far more so than almost any other colonizing nation, the French were concerned with the evangelization and conversion of the native populations. The names of the famous missionaries, such as Claude Allouez, Jacques Marquette, and the North American martyrs, have come down as a memorial to the sacrificial spirit of the early clerics. Furthermore, among the Huron of southern Ontario, French Jesuit missionaries responded far more positively to native religious sentiments than did either contemporary English or Spanish missionaries. Unlike the English and Spanish, who on the whole believed that Christianization and enculturation went together, the French showed a surprising cultural sensitivity towards native society. Nor at its beginning were the settlements exclusively Catholic. At the onset of the Christianization of French Canada, a decree of toleration between Catholics and Huguenots was maintained. Henry IV of France was interested in transporting the tolerant spirit of the Edict of Nantes to the New World, and accordingly in both Acadia and Quebec, until the 1620s, Catholics and Protestants lived in harmony. By the end of this decade, however, the policy had begun to change. Cardinal Richelieu reorganized the Company of Quebec to ensure Catholic dominance and to remove official toleration of Protestantism. He also entrusted the missions of the colony to the Jesuits. These middle decades of the 17th century witnessed not only Protestant Catholic tensions, but also intra-Catholic ones. The French Catholic world was divided between Gallicans, who emphasized the subservience of the church to the state, and an ultramontane or Tridentine party, which emphasized loyalty to Rome and a centralized Roman Catholicism. Which vision would triumph in the New World? In this struggle, François de Montmorency Laval, 1623 through 1708, played a crucial role. Appointed Vicar Apostolic of New France, he arrived in Quebec in 1659 and left an indelible mark on the church in New France, both as Vicar Apostolic and later, 1674, as Bishop of the newly constituted Diocese of Quebec. He exercised discipline over clergy, maintained the independence of the church over against the state, and extended the church's role in education and reform. One of his tireless crusades was against the alcohol trade with the native peoples. Laval's endeavors, along with those of his successor, Jean-Baptiste de Saint-Vallier, gave a rigor to the church in New France, as well as a spiritual and intellectual conservatism that would continue well into the 20th century. When fellow religionists in the Old Country became attracted to Enlightenment ideas, Catholicism in New France remained united and conservative. This factor would be of crucial importance when New France fell under the domination of Protestant England in the next century. Of all the religious traditions transplanted in 17th century North America, the English Puritan experiment in New England was to have the most far-reaching effect. Both on the level of institution and symbol, the Puritan experience was to shape Christianity in North America profoundly. Puritans were British Protestants who saw their church as incompletely reformed in a number of areas. First, they found the willingness of English prelates to continue old practices such as vestments and saints' day, debilitating to true Christianity. The church must be fully purified, hence their appellation, Puritan. More importantly, Puritans reflected a distinct view of the true church. The church for them was to be a disciplined community concerned with the building up of the faithful. Such a church and community ought to be governed religiously by the rules of Scripture. Finally, Puritans emphasized a new way of understanding the Christian life. The transformed heart, manifested in a conversion experience, came to be seen as the mark of a true believer or saint. Such an experience could help answer the question that plagued many within the Reformed or Calvinistic tradition: how could one be certain of one's own predestined status? By the 17th century, conversion, which provided personal assurance, also increasingly became the criterion for full church membership. As the dissatisfaction increased over the inadequacies of the Elizabethan settlement and the religious policies of the Stuart monarchs offered little hope of change, the New World beckoned as a refuge. In 1620, a small group of radical Puritans or separatists, led by William Bradford, established an outpost in southern Massachusetts, which they named Plymouth in honor of the town they had left. These Pilgrims, as they later came to be known, were never a significant factor in 17th century religious life, but as a symbol they became a crucial part of the American national faith. Far more important was the large-scale migration of English Puritans to the New World beginning in 1630. Between 1630 and 1643, over 20,000 Puritans flocked to Massachusetts. These Puritans brought along with them a distinctive vision of their place in divine providence. In the famous words of John Winthrop, 1588 through 1649, their first governor, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." The invocation of such biblical imagery was not accidental. Puritans saw themselves as the new Israel, and their experiment as God's new Israel. The Puritan Holy Commonwealth was a vision of the Christian society unlike that found earlier. Convinced that in the experience of the Holy Spirit upon the heart of the individual, one could divine who were the true saints, Massachusetts Bay in the mid-1630s required a narration of the experience of regenerating grace as a prerequisite for church membership, and hence, indirectly for citizenship in the colony. All other persons would be merely attendees of the church and inhabitants of the Commonwealth. But if Puritans strove to establish holy commonwealths, they were holy in ways unlike earlier Christian societies. Church and state were separated to a degree unheard of in English society, and institutions and practices such as church courts and the public use of excommunication were excluded. The holiness stemmed from the fact that magistrates as well as ministers saw themselves under a solemn covenant with God and saw their secular duties as part of their religious calling. Although, as its subsequent history was to demonstrate, New England Puritan society was as capable of serving the world and the flesh as any other society, its religious vision, and in particular, its conception of itself as a city upon a hill, would be a recurring theme in American history. The presence of such vastly different religious visions would result in conflict, and in particular, the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism would be an overriding theme in North American religious life well into the 20th century. But these three great visions do not do justice to the complexity of the story of Christianity in North America. From early on, the New World was a place not only to attempt to reestablish the religious ideals of 17th century Europe, but also to strike out on new paths. From New England itself, Roger Williams helped in the establishment of the colony of Rhode Island, a shelter for persons distressed for conscience. For Williams, no society could ever be a new Israel, and hence none ought to enforce godliness. Likewise, in the area between New England and the Anglican southern colonies, in the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, a religious pluralism began to take root that would make them distinct. There, Dutch, Swedes, Germans, and Scotch-Irish coexisted, along with English-speaking Puritans and Anglicans. It was furthermore in the colony of Pennsylvania, under the leadership of William Penn and Quakers, that this religious and cultural pluralism reached its most vivid expression. The dual Quaker emphasis upon nonviolence and the recognition of the inner light in each human soul provided the justification for this policy of toleration. New challenges. The North American colonies had been founded as part of that great outpouring of religious excitement associated with the Reformation era. As this fervor began to recede, it inevitably affected colonial religious life, and hence by the early 18th century, none of the distinctive visions were quite what they had been. Just as in the Old World, the era of religious wars was succeeded by an age of reason, so too in the New World one found a growing interest in the natural world and the potency of human reason. Such trends, although never dominant, would play their role. Much of colonial Anglicanism drank deeply of the new spirit. Eschewing its Reformation theology, colonial Anglicanism emphasized reason, balance, human freedom, and morality. These emphases played an important role in the growth of Anglicanism in the northern colonies, where it was embraced as a religious alternative to Puritanism. The emphasis upon humanitarianism also bore practical fruit in a wide variety of actions. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, founded in 1701, emphasized the evangelization and catechesis of the slave community. The new humanitarian spirit of the 18th century perhaps culminated in the founding of the colony of Georgia, 1733, by James Oglethorpe. Established as a second chance for honest debtors, Georgia was conceived of as a model society. Slavery and spirituous beverages, for example, were both outlawed. The colony, however, did not prosper, and by mid-century had largely abandoned its higher moral vision, but it nonetheless stood as a symbol of the new spirit of natural philanthropy. The new spirit of reason and morality would have an even greater effect upon the Puritan commonwealths. The failure of Puritanism in England with the Restoration, and a loss of a sense of eschatological expectation, led to soul-searching among New England Puritans. Preachers denounced the decline in vitality since the founding of the colony. These Jeremiads, as the sermons were called, may have spoken more to perception than to reality, but by the 18th century, changes had taken place that modified the Puritan pristine vision of the true church and true state. The notion of a church of visible saints was tempered in 1662 when Massachusetts clergy accepted a halfway covenant that allowed unconverted individuals, that is, the children of church members, a halfway church membership. Although unable to receive communion or vote in church elections, they could have their children baptized. Similarly, the Puritan vision of the godly commonwealth received a severe blow in the issuing of a new charter for the Massachusetts colony in 1691 that shifted the condition for voting privileges from church membership to property. These tensions may have lain behind the infamous Salem witch trial, 1692, at which 19 people were hanged. On still another front, the new learning of post-1660 Europe was beginning to find favor at institutions such as Harvard and Yale College. All of these trends were vague, but the result was that from the heart of New England there began to be heard claims for Arminianism. Arminianism in the New World, however, bore little parallel with the technical theological debates among 17th century Dutch Calvinists. Rather, it was a movement to elevate the role of reason, conscience, and human freedom in the religious life. Wars and the Great Awakening. Christianity in North America would be profoundly affected by religious and political changes in the middle of the 18th century. Wars and awakenings would leave their mark on both Canada and the United States and largely transform the older colonial religious visions. Like their European compatriots, North American Protestants felt the effects of the movement known as Pietism, with its emphasis on vital piety and a zeal for missionary outreach. In the middle colonies of America, the message of continental pietism found voice in ministers such as Theodore Frelinghuysen, 1691 through 1747. Other channels of transmission also operated, and the result was a resurgence of heartfelt religious revivals, known as either the Great Awakening or Great Awakenings. Whether this was a unified movement, as subsequent generations understood it to be, or rather a sense of disconnected local events linked only by later memory, as some scholars now argue, is unclear. But the effect was truly great. It reshaped the religious topography of Protestant North America, as individuals from Nova Scotia to Georgia felt the impact of the new preaching and piety. One can see the awakening reflected in a number of phases. The first is often referred to as the Frontier Revival and was rooted in rural New England. There, in the mid-1730s, as preachers railed against the new spirit of Arminianism, they began to experience large numbers of conversions, and a great and earnest concern about the great things of religion became universal, and among all persons of all degrees and all ages. The revival was duly recorded by the pastor-theologian Jonathan Edwards, 1703 through 58, in A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. Although it was only a brief and relatively small affair, the revival generated great excitement. As the British hymn writer Isaac Watts noted, "Never did we hear or read, since the first ages of Christianity, any event of this kind so surprising as the present narrative has set before us." The Frontier Revival was only a prelude, however, to the great stir caused by the preaching of George Whitefield. Whitefield, an Anglican priest and associate of John Wesley, made numerous visits to America, but his second visit of 1739 through 41 was perhaps his most celebrated. One of the great preachers of the century, of whom it was said that he could bring a crowd to tears by simply pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. Whitefield created a stir wherever he went. His dramatic, forceful preaching style and his emphasis upon the new birth drew crowds of tremendous size, culminating in his outdoor sermons on the Boston Common to as many as 30,000 people. Whitefield's preaching and fame spread the case for heartfelt religion throughout the colonies. But in Whitefield one sees another effect of the Great Awakening. In his journal, published after his return to England, he lamented the darkness he had found at Harvard and Yale and the lack of vital piety among many of the colonial clergy. Others took up Whitefield's practice of itinerancy, as well as criticism of colonial clergy. The Presbyterian Gilbert Tennant preached on the dangers of an unconverted ministry and urged believers to separate from such clergy. He argued, if the ministry of natural men be as it has been represented, then it is both lawful and expedient to go from them and hear godly persons. The challenge to the established ministry naturally increased the controversial nature of the awakening. By the mid-1740s, parties had developed within the northern colonies over the new message of the awakening. Northern Anglicans and many Congregationalists cautioned against the unleashing of enthusiasm, but others saw in the awakening a revitalization of religion. If the message of the awakening was controversial in the northern colonies, in the South it would prove to be revolutionary. There the message of heartfelt religion fell upon the colonists and created a crisis. The established Anglican Church and its vision of society was becoming more precarious, particularly among the small farmers of the Piedmont or western areas. Various groups preached the new message, Presbyterians and, by the 1770s, Methodists. But it was the Baptists who were to be the great apostles of the revivalist message in the colonial South. Missionaries from northern colonies, such as Shubal Stearns, 1706 through 71, preached the new message with emotional warmth and fervor. Their message, however, was not merely one of evangelistic religion, but also a democratic critique of the hierarchical social order reflected by colonial Anglicanism. This critique, when ultimately loosed by the American Revolution, would fundamentally transform Southern culture and leave little remaining of the colonial Anglican vision. A final phase of the awakening can be called the Canadian phase, and would leave its mark upon maritime Canada. Through the preaching of Henry Alline, 1748 through 84, the message of heartfelt religion would win over many Canadian Protestants. Yet, as we will see, the social implications of the Canadian Awakening would be far different from that of the lower colonies. The Awakening was to have profound long-term effects. If, on the one hand, it was a divisive movement, spawning separatism and critics, it was to have a unifying effect as well. The message of evangelical Protestantism increasingly became the religious cement binding together the different parts of the colonies. The diverse religious visions of the early colonial period were ultimately undermined by this new evangelical understanding. Likewise, the new spirit of evangelical awakening quickened an interest in missions, and along with this a concern to spread the message to the outcasts of the colonial social order. David Brainerd, 1718 through 47, son-in-law of Jonathan Edwards, began a mission to Native Americans, though with comparatively little success. Of greater importance, the message began to spread to the African slave community. The issue of the evangelization of the slave community had been a thorny one, and before the middle of the century, the few efforts at Christianization had been under the auspices of colonial Anglicans. But the new message found favor among African Americans, and increasingly the message of a heartfelt gospel became the common piety of both blacks and whites. But perhaps the most far-reaching effect of the Great Awakening was on the understanding of history and destiny. The era of the Awakening also saw a rising popularity in the idea of post-millennialism, or the belief that the golden age of the kingdom of God would occur before the return of Jesus. This belief was taken up by the Awakening's proponents and engendered a degree of excitement and possibility in the view of the future. Furthermore, some writers, such as Jonathan Edwards, speculated concerning the possibility of this hoped-for golden age beginning in the New World. By the 1750s, this expectation was given a political twist, and the millennial expectation began to affect the way in which particularly New England Protestants viewed the course of current events. Language of liberty and virtue became enmeshed with the prospect of the millennium, and the result was what has been called a civil millennialism, which saw the triumph of the divine kingdom not only in the success of true Protestant piety and religion, but also in the advance of liberty and freedom. This way of reading the signs of the times would be crucially important because there appeared to be many such signs. The first 6 decades of the 18th century witnessed continual clashes between the empires of Catholic France and Protestant Britain, and this struggle had religious corollaries. As might be expected, the cross often followed the crown, and British successes in wresting the maritime provinces away from France were quickly followed by plantings of Protestant churches. With the British presence in Acadia, Nova Scotia, Protestantism took root in Canada. Although French Catholics were guaranteed for free exercise of their religion by the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, by mid-century, a process of Protestantization was underway. In 1755, British administrators ordered the evacuation of the Acadians from Nova Scotia, and in 1758, the Church of England was made the established church. These apparent triumphs of Protestantism over Rome excited many New England Protestants. When the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island fell in 1745 to a New England army, it was announced that God had triumphed gloriously over his and our anti-Christian enemies. The final triumph of Britain over the French Catholic Empire was greeted with equal celebration. Britain had the more difficult task, however, of incorporating Canada into its haphazardly gained empire. Part of this necessitated a religious policy. What should be done with the French Catholic community? During the first decade of British rule of Canada, its policies were marked by ambivalence. The formal goal, as implied in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, was Anglicization, particularly since many feared the French Catholic clergy as agents of disloyalty. Yet the practical difficulties of forcing such a large alien population to abandon its historic ways were likewise recognized. A formal British policy was finally established in the Quebec Act 1774. In it, Catholics were granted free exercise of religion, the church's hierarchy was recognized, and the right to receive customary dues was affirmed, and the property rights of seminaries and religious orders, except for the Jesuits, who were suppressed and dissolved, acknowledged. The act also implicitly allowed for French Catholic participation in the political life of the province. Thus it seemed as if the problem of French Canada had been solved. These events, however, were viewed far differently by the lower colonies. The acceptance of the Catholic hierarchy by the Quebec Act was viewed as scandalous, and the act's extending of the province down to the Ohio River, lands on which the colonies also had claims, was seen as sinister. Furthermore, at the same time, colonial Anglicans renewed their campaign to establish a colonial episcopate. The campaign for an American bishop evoked in Northern colonists memories of Charles I and William Laud, while in the South, fears arose that resident bishops would threaten the vestry system. The struggle over bishops convinced many that tyranny and the destruction of liberty lay at the root of the imperial agenda, while the acceptance of Roman Catholic claims in the Quebec Act raised the fear of Catholic influence. These religious paranoias fed into the American Revolutionary War and left their mark upon the religious life of North America. In the 13 colonies, Christians found themselves divided. Some were patriots, particularly among the Puritans of New England, the Presbyterians of the Middle Colonies, and to a lesser degree the Southern Anglicans. Others, particularly but not exclusively Northern Anglicans, were loyalists. Many others remained neutral. The two regions most affected by the war would be the American South and Canada. In Virginia, for example, the privileged status of the Anglican Church was removed by degrees between 1776 and 1785. Furthermore, with the withdrawal of public support, many clergy left the state. The result was the large-scale collapse of Southern Anglicanism. The once proud established Church of Virginia shrank from over 90 clergy to only 13. The vacuum created by the collapse of Anglicanism allowed for the rapid growth of evangelical denominations. Even more than Baptists, the Methodists grew in the South. The war propelled Canadian church life in a very different direction. The magnanimity of the Quebec Act assured the loyalty of the French Catholic community to Britain during the war. The Bishop of Quebec, Jean-Oliver Briand, for example, instructed his clergy to refuse the sacraments to Canadians siding with the American patriots. Likewise, the influx of over 35,000 loyalists did much to bolster Canadian Protestantism. Convinced that the problems of the 13 colonies had stemmed from an inadequate linking of church and empire, the British Crown took steps to put the Church of England on a firm legal footing in English-speaking Canada. Charles Inglis was appointed Bishop of Nova Scotia in 1787, and in 1791 the British Parliament established the Church of England in British Canada and endowed it with resources. Finally, the American struggle forced Canadian Christians to begin to reflect upon their distinctiveness. One sees this in the career of Henry Alline. Alline was one of the many New Englanders who began settling in the Canadian Maritime region at the end of the 7 Years' War. Converted in 1775, he began a vigorous preaching ministry emphasizing the theme of the new birth and became known as the leader of the Great Awakening in Nova Scotia. But part of Alline's message involved the exceptionalism and mission of the maritime community. They were a people highly favored of God, for whom loyalty to Christ necessitated abstention from the great conflict between Britain and her colonies to the south. The war, he argued, was a judgment on both Britain and the colonies. Thus, if the influence of the awakening was to light fires of revolution in the lower colonies, in Canada its influence was to dampen them. Like most wars, the American Revolution disturbed much of the settled religious life of the areas affected. Populations were dispersed, property was destroyed, and the long-established rhythms of piety were disturbed. At the end of the 18th century, the different religious communities began the process of picking up the pieces. For some, such as the Congregationalists, who were the heirs of the New England Puritans, the transition was a relatively smooth one. With their standing order, or establishments, still intact, they continued in their traditional role. Other communities were much more adversely affected. In particular, Anglicans and Quakers suffered as a result of the Revolution and did not fully rebound until the next century. But if these early years of the Republic were years of dislocation for some, for others they provided the opportunity for organization. The small American Catholic community, largely concentrated in Pennsylvania and Maryland throughout the colonial period, had been under various legal restraints. The new state constitutions springing up after the Revolution, however, included articles on religious freedom. Accordingly, in 1783, clergy in Maryland began working on a plan for the organization of the Catholic community. The next year, John Carroll, 1735 through 1815, was appointed Superior of the Mission, and in 1790 was consecrated Bishop of Baltimore. Still another group that began to organize during these years was the Free African American community. Many African Americans had been affected by the evangelistic message of the Great Awakening preaching, and in the Chesapeake Bay area, they enthusiastically supported the Young Methodist movement. Racial tensions, however, were never absent. After a particularly unpleasant incident in which African American worshipers were pulled from their knees while in prayer because they were occupying the wrong part of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, African Americans established independent worshiping communities. The story of the institutional development of these communities is somewhat convoluted, but by the early 19th century, two independent African American denominations had taken root: the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion. During these years, independent African American Baptist churches also began to be established. These churches quickly became the centers for the free African communities. This concludes Part 1.